Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here again. I was here in 2009, and I hate to say it, having a lot of the same discussions that we're having today. So what is going on? I've got about 10 minutes to cover this, so we're going to go fast. I think we all understand that we're at the cusp of a very transformative period in the history of our development. It is systemic. We see it in socioeconomics, sociopolitics, and as they relate to geopolitics. It's obviously in the environment, and it's in technology. And we're not entirely sure where it's headed, but we're pretty certain it's going to be a wild rodeo. So I think we need to look where we've come from in order to understand where we're going. In fact, there was a quote earlier by Theodore Roosevelt that said just as much. And I'm going to take you through a quick paleontological trip through time. And I like to start simple and small, so we'll start with the universe. Our universe was formed 13.8 billion years ago. It took 9 billion years for our solar system to form and our planet along with it. Just gas and matter at first. It took about 2 billion years for photosynthetic life to help generate the oxygen in our atmosphere. And for the next billion years, and 2 billion years actually, life existed only in microscopic organisms. 650 million years ago, the planet was entirely covered in ice. We call it the snowball Earth. And it was volcanic activity through tectonic plates that released the CO2 into the atmosphere and melted this giant sheet of ice into a vast planetary ocean. It took about 1,000 years. The balance of nitrogen, oxygen, CO2, water vapors, and argon constitutes a thin layer of atmosphere, which 580 million years ago led to the first multi-complex cellular life. And the period between 541 million years and 66 million years saw the most dramatic evolutionary, climatic, and geological transformation in our planet. Fish, amphibian, reptiles, and then birds and mammals all evolved during that period. In this span until present, there have been 5 mass extinction events. The Permian extinction event 252 million years ago led to 4% survivors. In fact, every single one of us today here are direct descendants of the 4% survivors of the Great Permian extinction event. The last one was the 66 million years ago when allegedly an asteroid hit the planet and destroyed 76% of all living things, dinosaurs included. 6 million years ago, we evolved from the ape and evolved into anatomically modern humans about 200,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago, in the scheme or the timeline of the planet is like a nanosecond. We've barely even existed. I mean, if you were to look at the age of the planet as one calendar year and condense it between January and the end of December, the start of the planet would have been 4.5 billion years ago, going all the way to present. Humanity would not have existed until 30 seconds before midnight on December 31st of that geological year. Civilization, 1/10 of a second. During that time period, we've managed to pour so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that we have fundamentally altered the chemistry of the air and the acidity of the ocean, choking it from its ability to make life. There's so much pollution right now in the oceans alone that by 2050 there'll be more plastics than there will be fish. We are presently experiencing the 6th mass extinction event. And scientists tell us that by the end of the century, up to 75% of species will have gone extinct. Let me see, I've got water. Can I have some water? Mass extinction events take 10 million years to recover. This, of course, doesn't just apply to the animals. We're also seeing in the human world, thank you very much, 1/4 of humans, 25%, that is 1.7 billion people, are experiencing extremely high level of baseline water stress. This is leading to conflicts around the world. This entire map here tells you where the water-stressed areas are. And the ones that are particularly interesting are between Mali and Somalia, an area that has about 500 million people, where already biological, insect life, animal life, and human lives are migrating away from regions that are uninhabitable. This is about 500 million people. There are presently 70 million people that are either seeking asylum, refugees, or seeking asylum around the world. This is a refugee camp that I visited in Jordan that is home to 1.4 million people, almost the size of Munich that we're here today. And the UN tells us that by the end of the millennia, at the end of the century that is, we will have up to 1 billion refugees. By 2050, maybe 350 million refugees. This leads to a good question. Where are we going? There are 3 agents of change. You have elected officials, business leaders, and of course the public opinion. In 2019, it took the voice of a 16-year-old Sweden to remind us to use our voice. We are reactive. We are certainly aware of the issues, and in many ways we are addressing them. But this leads me to rule number 1. Just because someone is in charge, don't expect that they're going to know what they're doing. The reaction of the Prime Minister in Australia about the Australian fires was to say that he's hoping that they will increase their export of coal within the next 10 years. Donald Trump is dismantling decades of environmental policy in just a couple of years. And so it begs the question, when you look at the financial metrics and an economy that ultimately at the present is doing rather well in first world nations. We have a stock market in the US that is at record highs. We have employment rates that are hovering around 3%, both in the US and Germany as well. And yes, we understand that somehow this is the tip of an iceberg, that we're not actually seeing the full picture. And if the popular uprising that we're seeing in Chile, simultaneously in Paris, in Iran, in India, in Venezuela, and the list goes on, speaks to an environment of fear. People are internally ill at ease with what is going on. So this leads to rule number 2. Crisis management is not a strategy. Risk mitigation is. We have known for a very long time that these problems were coming. In fact, environmental science has predicted these phenomena, and we've seen them growing. And yet, of all the signatories of the Paris Agreement, which Mark just made allusion to, only 26 of them have met their mandate. This was 5 years ago. I was in Paris. It was probably one of the greatest moments in the history of the environmental movement, and yet only 28 nations have met their mandate. All we need to do if we want to see where the planet will be with high levels of CO2 is to take a little time machine called geology. Through paleontologists, we are able to measure the levels and the temperatures that date back to hundreds of thousands of years, in fact, up to millions of years. And 3 million years ago, the planet had essentially the same level of CO2 parts per million in the atmosphere. We're presently at about 412 parts per million. 3 million years ago, we were hovering around 380 parts per million, so relatively similar. Temperatures globally were 2.6 degrees to 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit higher than they are today, and ocean levels were 16 meters higher. Paleontology gives us a time machine that can both travel in the future and in the past and help us understand what is going on. So this leads me to rule number 3. 21st century problems will not be solved with money. They need to be solved with attitudes. And in fact, if we recognize that the hallmark of a modern society has been to help us bring humanity to a level where human life is a human right, we're quickly devolving it to a privilege. And in fact, if you look at the amount of refugees around the world, it's becoming very clear that our system is unstable. And in physics, a subject that I've studied in climatology, you know that instability is always the precursor to a crash. And with that, I can't help but think that Marie Antoinette didn't lose her head in 1793 because she was living in a stable system. We are presently in a very, very unstable system that requires enormous amount of attention. And remarkably, we have a 100% successful plan for resolving the climate issues, and it's right here. It's essentially a smart grid, decentralized distribution of renewable energies, carbon capture and sequestration of CO2, circular and shared economy, reducing our waste, and e-mobility, zero-emission transportation. And finally, which I think is perhaps the most important on that list, is education. Science and technology will run the world, but the only thing that separates us from not being programmed by the computers that we once programmed is the one thing that makes us inherently human, and that is our empathy. Robots are taking labor away from humanity, which is essentially robbing away the one existential purpose of humanity dating back 2 million years. What will humanity mean when 70% of labor will be obsolete? Labor obsolescence will redefine the nature of what it is to be a human, and we need to be prepared with that by understanding what is the role of a human in society relative to one another and relative to the nature and the planet that we inhabit. Finally, we must make sure that within this entire educational framework that we're discussing even today, that the nature of technology is indispensable to our progress. But what is most indispensable to our survival is to reconnect ourselves to the environment that has brought us here in the first place. Finally, I will say that climate change is the one link that connects us to nature. If it breaks, we break. And in order to be reconnected with this nature, we need to understand how to be empathetical to all things, including ourselves, because we will not get to save ourselves and the planet unless we care for it. You know, I'll leave you with one quote from Churchill. He has so many great ones. But in 1941, he was told to cut off the art budget in favor of the war effort. And Churchill's response was, well, if we do that, what are we fighting for? And I would like to use that metaphor for this present age of technology, which is amazing as it brings all this tremendous amount of output and data and performance, and it takes away some of the labor from us so that hopefully all we'll have to do is basically play sports, write poetry, and have sex. But there's a price to that. And that price is going to be individual freedom. And the only way that we can protect ourselves from being robbed away of our liberal democracy so hardly fought is to understand the value of the human voice, its relationship to the other individual, and its relationship to the greater good, which is our planet. Thank you very much.